Hi everyone. The technology that I chose for my TPR is Geographic Information Systems, or GIS. A quick overview, GIS is a framework or software that allows users to gather, manage, and analyze data. There are lots of practical uses for GIS within conservation. So it can be used to help identify problems, monitor change, to manage and respond to events, and then it can also be used to do things like forecast or prioritize or understand trends that we see. I thought it would be useful to go over a few recent studies that use GIS in different ways, just to sort of understand what all GIS can do, especially in terms of conservation. So the first study I found was from 2019. The authors used satellite images from 2004, 2011, and 2017 to determine land cover change. They were looking specifically at two protected areas in Bangladesh. And so they used these satellite images to determine what the land cover was at each time. And then you just use that information to determine the success of forest management strategies. And so here you can see some of the maps that were generated. They're the two protected areas. And the one thing that you notice, especially in the second set of maps, is that there is a lot more red in 2011 and 2017 than there was in 2004. And that does show that there's a lot more non-forest area. So it's a very good graphic to show you that change. Another study was looking at genetic diversity, and so it was using this computer software to look at genetic diversity of wild almond species in Iran. And so the authors collected samples from 12 different provinces around the country. They completed a genetic analysis of those populations. And then they were able to use a spatial analysis and the genetic analysis together to look at intraspecific diversity. So just how much genetic diversity there was within this almond species. And then they were able to use that GIS to predict like different limiting factors in different areas, and just to help improve monitoring the almond diversity. Another use for GIS is to evaluate complex systems that have a lot of data. And so this study from 2019, GIS was used to integrate lots of different types of data into one study. So the authors were looking at soil erosion of 4 basins in Malaysia. And so again, they were using land use maps, this time from 1984, 2002, and 2013, as well as soil maps. And they also used rainfall data to help look at like possible erosion. And so the data showed that all 4 basins in the study had experienced a great deal of land use change from 1984 to 2013. And so they were also able then to use an extension of ArcGIS to calculate the amount of soil loss in each of the different basins. And so there was a lot of data involved in this. And so the GIS program was very helpful in generating these maps just to show soil erosion based on all of those different factors. GIS has also been used to help monitor migration. And so in this case, the study authors were looking at migration of birds in Europe, and they were also trying to look at the fruit availability along the migration routes. So they made a database that contained information on over 50 wild plant species, and they were looking at things like when the plants had fruit on them and when the birds were passing through those areas. So they were able to create that database, but then also go back through and compare what they modeled to ground data. And they did find that September through October had the highest fruit availability, which matched the peak of berry-eating birds in those areas. So studies like this are useful when looking at migration patterns and looking at where migrating species will stop and when they'll stop. And so this was another use of GIS. This study in 2018 was looking at ecological hotspots in 3 countries in Africa. And so not only were the authors looking at these hotspots, but they also added like another level to this by working with stakeholders in the area. And so they interviewed 31 different stakeholders about which ecosystem services they thought were important. And then they were able to use the GIS data looking at things like land degradation, and where the stakeholders found the most important ecological services. And so really what this study found was that models can be a way more effective tool when they're corroborated by stakeholders, especially when you're talking about things like land use and ecosystem services, because it can be a much more powerful tool if the people in the area find value in the ecosystem services that you're trying to conserve. And then this last study is looking at a bird in South America. And so scientists created a classic species distribution model. So looking at where the species was found, they looked at things like climate change. They looked at different land cover changes at a much larger level. And then they were able to predict how the population of the birds responded to change in habitat and fragmentation. And really what they found was that sort of taking all of these different data pieces together improved the approach of this classic species distribution model. And so again, you kind of using GIS as an additional tool in conservation just had a lot of benefits to it. And then, so just to kind of summarize some GIS strengths that we see from these example studies, it's really good for assessing historical data. You can use older aerial photos to look at things like land use. It's good for analyzing genetic and species diversity. Anytime you have like a complex system and have lots of data, it's useful for looking at how those systems change. It can be used to trace patterns such as migration. You can use this for participatory mapping, so you can interview stakeholders and plot their information as well. And then there's lots of different applications for conservation. So some of the ones that were talked about in these examples were looking at things like habitat and species distribution, looking at different ecosystems, things like that. Now there are some weaknesses that we need to consider with GIS as well. So GIS is very data intensive. And without the data, it's not going to run, it's not going to give you anything. But if you have a problem that requires the incorporation of lots of data, this can be a very helpful tool. GIS software is fairly expensive, and it is time intensive to learn. The big example that I found was that it requires a pretty complex command language. And there can also be errors for larger scale maps just due to the shape of the Earth. Now something that I think is interesting is comparing GIS to Google Earth. So the GIS software has to be purchased. It's a little bit more complicated, harder to use, which leads to it mainly being used by organizations and companies and less by individuals. But it does allow for really good manipulation of parts of the maps that you create. Google Earth, on the other hand, is accessible by everyone. It's easy to download, easy to use right away. It's free, it's open source. It's used by a lot more civilians and individuals as compared to GIS, but it doesn't have quite as much functionality as GIS does. So there are also some drawbacks to using Google Earth. And just in general, the future of GIS, there are like lots of potential ways that GIS can be used. So it could be for things like finding appropriate habitats for wildlife, looking at things like wildlife corridors, especially in like a planning and zoning type of capacity. And one project that I thought was pretty interesting was the Globe Biomass Project, which is mapping the biomass of forests around the world using satellite data. And I just thought that sounded like a pretty cool project and a cool use for GIS. And that about sums it up. So thank you for listening.